African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. The Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. Account for the Sudan Civil War between 1956 to 2004. To what extent was colonial legacy responsible for the outbreak of the Sudan Civil War in 1956? To what extent were economic factors responsible for the outbreak of the Sudan Civil War after 1983? Political factors made the outbreak of the Sudan Civil War inevitable. Discuss. The outbreak of Sudan Civil War in 1956 was inevitable. Discuss. The Sudan Civil War was a conflict between Arab North Muslim Sudanese and the Black South Sudanese. It was a conflict since 1956, immediately after independence. Historically, Sudan was administered by two colonial masters such as Britain and Egypt in what came to be known as the Condominium Administration. The war was fought in three phases. The first phase in 1956, which started as a military rebellion of the army units in the Equatorial and Upper Nile but was defeated. The second phase was fought between 1962 to 1972 by a rebel movement, the Nasnik Poison, led by Joseph Logu. The third phase was spearheaded by John Garang and his boss /M from 1983 to 2004. The main causes of the Sudan Civil Wars were largely colonial in nature. Colonial factors. 1. The presence of two colonial masters in Sudan caused the Civil War. Britain and Egypt colonized Sudan. Egypt took the northern part and the British conquered the southern part. These two colonial masters pursued different colonial practices before independence. At independence, the South and the North were clearly different in politics, development, and were opposed to each other. This caused hostility between the North and the South. 2. The British use of indirect rule caused the civil war in Sudan. The British made use of Arabs from the North to rule over the black Southerners. The Arab Northerners were visibly ruthless and boastful and tortured the Southerners to the extent of planting seeds of hatred. Therefore, soon after independence, the South and the North fought as a matter of retaliation or revenge. 3. The presence of different religions in different regions caused the Civil War. The British preached in favor of Christianity in the South and discouraged Islam among the Southerners. Egypt promoted Islam in the North and applied Sharia law freely. Christianity was demonized. After independence, Arabs tried to enforce Islam and Sharia law among the Southerners, which they refused. This resulted into misunderstandings between the Black South and the Arab North. African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. 5. Colonial administration promoted imbalanced development. The North developed ahead of the South. By independence, the South had inaccessible roads, poor education facilities, poor health facilities. Most of the developed facilities were congested in the North, which was close to sea and inhabited by the people whom the British thought were easier to condition to British rule. This did not sound well for the Southerners and thus opted for the war. 6. Discrimination of the Southerners in the National Assembly resulted into the Sudan Civil War. The National Assembly catered for the interests of the Arabs in form of membership and language. Arabic language was used in conducting parliamentary businesses, yet the Southerners were English speakers. The majority of legislators in the parliament were Arabs. The Southerners were largely spectators. This built up the conflict. 7. The colonialists failed to unite the people in Sudan. The North and the South remained largely different from one another. For example, parliamentary system of administration had only 3 representatives from the South out of the 46 seats. Even posts in the civil service that were left by the colonialists were handed over to the Northerners. This planted seeds of misunderstanding. 8. The colonial masters failed to manage Africanization process of the Sudan affairs. When the British provided self-governance to the Sudanese in 1953 and the civil service was Africanized, 800 posts became vacant. 794 of the vacancies were shared by the Northerners and 6 job posts were struggled by the Southerners. This positioned the Northerners in all the commanding heights of the economy to the annoyance of the Southerners. 9. The British discouraged interaction between the Northerners and Southerners. The Northerners employed in the South were transferred back to the North, and the Muslims who tried to do business in the South were not granted permits or trading licenses. This act caused in the minds of both the Arab Muslims and black Christians that they were not people of the same nation and thus became terrible enemies at independence. Other factors. 1. The formation of rebel groups led to Sudan Civil War. Joseph Logu established the Nyanya movement, which engineered the second phase of the Sudan Civil War. John Garang formed the Sudanese People's Liberation Army SPLA, which encouraged the Civil War of 1983–2004. These movements wanted to grab political power and the authority from the South. 2. The presence of strong rebel leaders in the South led to the Civil War. In 1962, Joseph Logu, driven by power-thirsty, started the war against Khartoum government. In 1983, John Garang, with a similar ambition, formed the SPLA to fight for power and authority. This was shown by their unwillingness to accept northern government and abuse of set peace agreements. 3. Massive corruption in the country in form of nepotism, bribery, and physical stealing of property influenced the civil war in Sudan. Much of the money was spent on the Islamic religious festivals where the Southerners were not invited. The Northerners lived in extreme luxury while the South was in utter need. This caused the civil war. 4. Unfair distribution of job opportunities after independence caused the civil war. In 1963, the government of General Abbott announced the general recruitment of the army and the police cadet officers. Altogether, 216 officers were wanted to manage 216 units, 120 of which were in African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. The South, but only 4 cadets were recruited in the North who also refused to report for training. This accelerated the Civil War. 5. The memory of the 19th century slave trade practice caused the Sudan Civil War. The Arabs captured and sold the black Southerners into slavery. A slave trade market center was put at Khartoum, and blacks were systematically brutalized, and thus Khartoum became the symbol of bad memories. The Southerners did not pardon the Arabs and did not accept to share the same county as people. 6. The introduction of Sharia law in the post-independence among the Southerners led to the Civil War. Sharia law called for amputation of arms if convicted for stealing, stoning to death to adulterers, flogging in the public for alcoholism or just handling it. Many of these offences were in the South, and therefore Southerners became permanent culprits. The Southerners were forced to abandon English and adopt Arabic speaking. Quranic schools were enforced to the dismay of the Southerners. 7. Cultural arrogance displayed by the Northerners caused the Civil War. The Northern Arabs boasted of their light skins over the Southern dark-skinned people. They claimed that due to their beautiful colour they were to rule over the blacks, the reason why the Anglo-Egyptian condominium of the Arabs was formed. This did not please the Southerners, who felt humiliated because of their dark colour. 8. The creation of alternative system of administration in the South influenced the civil war in Sudan. In every captured area, the rebels built schools, dispensaries, and adopted to the East African mode of education. This was looked at by the North as an attempt for the South to break away from Khartoum government. 9. Discovery of oil in the South caused the Civil War. Oil in the South created extreme selfishness/economic nationalism among the Southerners and didn't want to share the resources with the Northerners. The oil was extracted by foreign powers like US and as a result passed a lot of money to SPLA. This alarmed USSR and Arab government, which supported the Khartoum government to rescue the oil resource. 10. Continued underdevelopment of the South after independence accelerated the Civil War. The Khartoum government destroyed colonial establishments in the South. No infrastructure was put up, towns were destroyed, poverty and illiteracy increased. This made it easy to mobilize the disgruntled Southerners into rebel activities. 11. The Southerners opposed the digging of Jonglei Canal by the government of Jaffa Nimri from September 1969, in an attempt to divert River Nile flow by bypassing the Jonglei swamp where most water evaporates and thus saving 5 million m3 of water. The Jonglei Canal was dug, however during its construction it caused flooding and destruction of people's homes and gardens. People were displaced and region's ecological balance was destabilized. The Southerners interpreted this act as a malicious act by the Northerners to displace them and cause famine. Effects of the Sudan Civil War of 1956–2004. African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. 1. Thousands of the Sudanese lost their lives during the ruthless suppression by the Khartoum government. Over 1.5 million lives became martyrs of the Civil War. 2. There was economic destruction of Sudan. 1/5 of the budget of Sudanese economy was spent on the war, and by 1979 Sudan was already facing economic troubles, petrol shortage, acute inflation, heavy taxes, among others. 3. The South remained largely underdeveloped. Medical services remained largely backward, and as a result, there was outbreak of epidemics like in 1971, cholera epidemic broke out. 4. There was famine outbreak. Several people were exposed to starvation, mainly in rebel held zones. The government could intentionally destroy crop gardens to deny food to the rebels. 5. Refugee crisis resulted. Civilians were compelled to run out of the war zones into the forests. Across the boundaries to Uganda, DRC, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Central Africa Republic of about 2.5 am internally displaced. 6. Led to rampant military coups. There were rampant military coups one after the other due to economic problems and failure of successful governments to end civil war, thus the 1958. 7. There was a bitter interstate relation. Sudan had severe relations with neighbors during the civil war, conflicted with Uganda, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, leading to exchange of gunfire and expulsion of diplomats. 8. Resulted into civil wars in neighboring countries. For example, the Khartoum government-sponsored Lord Resistance Army LRA of Joseph Kony sparked off civil war in Chad, Ethiopia, among others. 9. Led to violation of rights. In order to suppress the southern spirit of secession, there was inhumane treatment of Southerners. For example, the martial law imposed by Jaffa Nimri in 1972 characterized by flogging and amputation of limbs. 10. Sudan became a Cold War theater where the superpowers settled their ideological conflicts. USSR was for the Khartoum government to enrich communism, and USA, USSR, Israel, and Arab countries. 11. Resulted into secession South Sudan in 2011, and Salva Kiir became the first president of South Sudan. 12. The conflict attracted humanitarian outcry from the human rights bodies. OU, UN and Churches. The All-African Council of Churches OU, UN tried several times to mediate peace in South Sudan and help the displaced. 13. It portrayed the good work of OAU, UN and sister donor countries. This tried to enforce unity between the North and South Sudan, blamed extrajudicial killings, condemned countries that fueled the war in Sudan. The Chad Civil WAR 1965-1982. 1. Account for the Chadian Civil War of 1965. 2. They examined the causes and effects of the Chad Civil Wars of 1965. 3. To what extent was colonial legacy responsible for the outbreak of the Chad Civil War of 1965? African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956-2004. 4. How far was France responsible for the civil war in Chad? 5. To what extent was Francois Tumbleby responsible for the outbreak of the Chad Civil War? 6. How did the Chad Civil War affect African unity? The Chad Civil War was staged up by the northern Muslims of Chad against the southern Christian-dominated government of Francois Tumbleby of the Chad Progressive Party. Chad was a former French colony that received independence from the French in 1960, and Tumbleby became its leader. He relied in his leadership on the Serer tribe of the south, and he extended the Serer dominance over the northern Muslim tribes like the Yondo, Taubans and Kanem-Bornu. Its leaders included Kwede Galkuni and Hissène Habre. Causes of the Chad Civil War. 1. Soon after independence in 1960, Tumbleby, the new president of Chad, began to practice tribalism ethnicity by favoring members of the Serer tribe. He made them to dominate the civil service, and they received the biggest percentage of the national cake. Northerners were neglected in the allocation of resources. The Taubans, dominant tribe in the north, felt discriminated and were forced to fight the government of Francois Tumbleby in 1965. 2. Dictatorship of the government of Tumbleby was responsible for the Chad Civil War. Tumbleby became a dictator immediately he assumed power. He oppressed all members of the opposition and even those within PPT party. Those who gave him advice were condemned. Many leaders went to jail as others fled to exile. 3. Tumbleby introduced single-party rule after banning opposition parties in 1962. Only PPT party was allowed to enjoy the political space, and by 1965 political intolerance was at its peak in Chad. 4. Tumbleby banned the activities of trade unions. He did not allow riots, strikes and demonstrations in the city. Workers were not allowed to have forum to express their voices. University student activities such as boycotts and demonstrations were ruthlessly dealt with. For example, in 1963 in Fort Lamy, demonstrating students were oppressed, thus created ground for the Civil War. 5. There was maladministration by the civil servants working in the north, which led to the Civil War. The civil servants from the south, mainly of the Serer tribe, did not do a neat job in the north. They were excessively brutal, proud and arrogant, and made the northern chiefs useless. Tumbleby replaced local leaders with civil servants mainly from the south. This was not welcomed by northerners, resulting into a bloody civil war. 6. High taxes imposed by the government of Tumbleby led to the Civil War. The government imposed heavy taxes on poor northerners. They were also tortured in the process of collecting taxes. Thus, this brutality practiced by tax collectors led to the riots in many districts in the north, such as Batha. These riots were later transformed to full-scale civil war. African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956-2004. 7. Religious differences between the north and the south led to the outbreak of the Civil War. Chad was torn apart by religious issues that corresponded with two opposing religions. The north embraced Islam and the south was partially Christian. The northern Muslims regarded the southerners as infidel, satanic, and therefore they took up arms against the Christian-dominated government. 8. The policy of Chaditude led to the Civil War. In 1973, Tumbleby started a cultural revolution in which he planned to Africanize, retraditionalize Chad. This cultural program was known as the Chaditude policy. Through this policy, Tumbleby tried to promote the Serer customary law throughout the country. Christian names in principle were banned/abolished and replaced with traditional names. For example, Tumbleby changed his name from Francois to Ngarda. He also changed names of many places. For example, Fort Lamy, the capital, was changed to N'Djamena. This did not please majority of the people in Chad, leading to the Civil War in 1965. 9. Tumbleby undermined the northern culture, which led to the Civil War. He refused northerners to carry knives, which northerners regarded as their traditional symbol to identity and defense. The Taubans were forbidden from wearing turbans and veils. This made the northern Muslims to develop a strong anti-southern sentiment, which resulted into the Civil War. 10. The formation of the Frolinet Chad National Liberation Front led to the Civil War. The opposition that was suppressed was later forced to go underground and in 1965 established Frolinet to stage a war of opposition against Tombabay. It acted as an umbrella organization for the disgruntled Northerners and suppressed opposition leaders. It sought for assistance nationally and internationally to bring to an end the government of Francois Tombabay. 11. External influence led to the Civil War. Libya under Muammar Gaddafi supported the Chadian rebels to overthrow Tombabay. Libya had strong interests in controlling Ayyuzu Strip. This strip was rich in minerals such as gold and aluminium, and it also had oil which Libya badly needed, and therefore Libya supported Frolinet from 1966 with a view of getting access to resources in the Ayyuzu region. This accelerated the conflict in Chad. 12. Colonial legacy led to the Civil War. The French created a conflict between the North and South. They worsened ethnic rivalries, religious conflicts, and regional imbalances. French favored the Christianized South and neglected the Muslim North. They made no effort to reconcile the North and the South, and therefore at independence Northerners had not prepared to simply watch inequality that had existed to continue. 13. Ideological differences sparked off the Civil War. The government of Tombabay was pro-capitalized, and it was influenced by USA and European countries. Northern rebels were supported USSR, therefore the arming of Northerners by socialist countries accelerated the war in Chad. 14. Thirst for power caused the Civil War in Chad. Right from independence, the government. African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. Gaucuni, Hiss and Haber among others, for they wanted to assume political responsibility in the country. This explains why ejected peace agreements all through. Even after 1975 military takeover of Felix Malum against Tombabay, his government was opposed and later overthrown in 1978. 15. OAU weakness made the Civil War inevitable in Chad. It failed to reconcile the conflicting parties, for example the government, Frolinet and FAM rebels. It failed to discipline its member countries that interfered in the affairs of Chad, such as Libya, Sudan, and Nigeria, among others. It also failed to raise the necessary budget to sustain the soldiers of torture to keep peace in Chad. 16. The double standards of UN made the Civil War in Chad a reality. It did not openly condemn foreign involvement in the Chadian affairs. It failed to condemn the capitalist countries that influenced the government of Tombabay to engage the rebels that were seeking for justice. It also failed to negotiate with the communist bloc that funded the underground movements of the rebel activities. The UN also failed to enforce the resolution of the Sheba and Dakano talks, which only facilitated the consummation of the Civil War. 17. Breakdown of dialogue efforts accelerated the Civil War. Serious talks began, for example, Sheba and Kano talks with a view of bringing about a ceasefire, creation of government of national unity, religious harmony, among others, but all these did not materialize. This only encouraged Frolinet and FAM rebels to continue with armed struggle. 18. The desire for social justice and equality caused the Chad Civil War. Ibrahim Abacha, the leader of the Radical Union National Chadian UNT and Ahmed Musaf movement, National de Liberation Chadian and MNLT, fought the government so as to realize social justice for all, equality and respect for all ethnic groups, hence the Civil War. 19. Tombabay's attempt to cleanse and purge the National Army led to the Civil War. After mishandling the 1963 elections, the president looked at the army officers as potential rivals, killers, and disloyal people. He resorted to arresting, imprisonment, torture, and assassination of army officers, which forced Felix Malum and those who joined Frolinet to fight against the government of Tombabay. Effects of the Chad Civil War. Negatives. Resulted into the 1975 military coup that toppled the government of Francois Tombabay by Felix Malum. Resulted into breakdown of peace agreements, for example the Jan 1977 Sheba Agreements/1978 Sheba Peace Plan, 1978 Benghazi Peace Talks, March 1979 Kano Talks, among others. African history, the Sudan Civil War 1956–2004. Tribalism increased, for example the Christian Sarah and the Muslim taboo, thus creating ground for further war. Led to overexploitation of Chadian resources by foreign powers, for example the mineral-rich Ayyuzu Strip in the north was highly exploited by Libya and the USSR. It increased neocolonialism. Foreign powers and multinational companies struggled to dominate Chad and exploit her resources. Exposed the weakness of UN and OAU, for the two failed to end the civil war and reconcile the conflicting parties. It resulted into a sharp conflict between Christianized African countries and Muslim-dominated countries. It paralyzed effective exploitation of Chadian natural resources, for example minerals in the Ayyuzu Strip. Resulted into gross loss of human lives. Mainly the Muslim Taban in the north perished in the war. Resulted into mass poverty in Chad as people were always on the run with suitable properly destroyed. Turned Chad into cold water spot/theater where superpowers USA and USSR battled out their conflict. USA was for the government of Tombombay in order to promote capitalism, and USSR was for the rebels to promote communism. A lot of infrastructure was destroyed. For example, in Enjayna, the district of Bath, among others, a lot was destroyed and urban life disoriented. Positives. OAU tried to enforce ceasefire agreement in the Jan 1977 peace talks. This tried to bring together Felix Malum, Hissan Haber, and Gauken. OAU tried to raise funds to help and end the Chadian civil war. It planned to raise $87,000 but secured $27,000 to finance the peacekeeping.